Okay, so we're going to talk about CSS Grid layout. Okay, so previously when you try to lay out something on your page, and the things you can only use to change the layout is something called float, which was covered in the first lecture. So basically that just says for everything after this element, they should appear instead of underneath the current component. It needs to appear either on the left or right hand side. And that gives you very little control of exactly where the things were positioned. Okay, and the problem to this, the solution to this problem is something called CSS layout. So you can exactly say, I want this components to be located on this row, this column. Okay, and so the CSS grid itself is very new. So as I mentioned here, and only last year it is starting to be supported by all the major browsers. So previously, if you want to use CSS Grid, you have to use some other libraries, like Bootstrap, would say convert those CSS Grid commands into the command that browser can support. Okay, but now you can actually use it. So that means you can build this grid layout for your page without using any external libraries. Okay, and in terms of actually the grid layout itself, it just say a collection of horizontal or vertical lines or grids. And the page usually, so these will change with the page itself. As the page becomes wider, then each columns will become wider. But the relative position between the components will stay the same. And so that's a simple examples. And you have a page which divided into, in this case, that's 12 columns, and each of them is called columns, and they also have this definition called gutter, which is a space between the columns. And when you lay out your element, you can say, okay, I want this element, for example, is my sidebar to be 3 columns wide, and you just set the width to 3 columns. And the height of the columns, the height of the component will change and depends on the same content of in that particular component. Okay, and so this is some examples. You have a HTML page, you have the head section, you have a little bit definition here in terms of how the page would look like. If I could be able to scroll, you can't scroll this one. At least this is still working. Let's try okay, so that's the start point. And if we look at the page, again, here I'll be using the inspector tools. Okay, so it's slightly easier. Okay, it doesn't allow me to go any further. And you can see these are the formattings applied to the body, and its width will be 90%, and the maximum width will be 900 pixels. And that means it doesn't want the page to be any wider than 900 pixels. And it says some margins. If you remember, each of these box element is essentially, you can have, each of the element is essentially a box. You can have margins, and that represents, say, the top is 2, the bottom is 2, and the other side, 2 sides is auto. And this is actually a quite simple trick, which you probably should use quite often. And by setting the right and left margin as auto, that centers an element if it's a grid. So for example, I can take this off. It removes the margin, but also by default, this grid or this whole body actually moves to the left-hand side. Okay, and there's some font formatting, and that's about it. And if you look at the container itself, inside the body, you can see some simple formatting applied to these container, which including all these divs. So it has some font, not even why it's not show up here? Sorry, it's up here. So it says had border radius is 5 pixels. This is something we saw before, and which give you a run to the corner of these div elements. So if you can untick it, you can see now it becomes squared corner, and this will give curved one. Okay. Does anyone still remember this? Why we have this greater than sign in the selector? Yeah. Yeah. So that means this formatting rules apply to the div, but only if it is a child of something of this dot container class. So that means anything outside this container, any div outside this container, these rules will not apply. And there's nothing else really that interesting here. So including some paddings, you can see the results here that give you a bit space between the text and the border of the div. And that's the background color. And finally, that's formatting the border and give it a kind of bluish color. That's all. So that's all the formatting we're starting with. So these are the formatting defined in between the style tag, and you can see in the board itself you have a div which has a container called class called container, and inside there are 7 more divs, and these will apply these formatting rules up here. Okay, let me see if I can run this live rather than say here. I will see if I can run this live. Chrome web server, choose. Yeah. And okay, that looks much better. Okay, yeah. Okay, so this is where we stopped, and if we keep continuing, so to define a grid, and all you need to do first is to add this line, say display grid. So that means, okay, tells the browser, say I'm going to using grid layout for this particular component, and if you remember, this container is this div class here, which including everything on this page they have. Okay, and by just defining this one, and it will not change anything because you haven't starting to set the size for the component using the grid yet. So the browser getting ready to use grid layout, but it doesn't know what to apply that to yet. Okay, and then this is where you're starting to applying to do give more details about how the grid would like it. So in this case, we want to define 3 columns, and each column is 200 pixels. So I want to use grid template column followed by 200 pixel, 200 pixel, and 200 pixel. So I mean, it's quite easy if you want to have more columns or different size of the columns, and they don't have to be same width, it can be different as well. And so now it would look like this. Okay, and so in this case, I define the container. So are you able to see the left-hand side? It's a bit dark, but I don't think I can change in the code pen. And you can see the where was the CSS? Where's container?
What are these FR?
Oh, okay.
These are not pixels.
No, these are not pixels. Sorry. Okay, so this is slightly different example, but we're going to cover FY in a second. But here it says for the container, I set the display as a grid, and I still use grid template columns. But instead of doing 200 pixels, I'm doing the FR, which one instead represents one fragment. So that basically means I want to divide the entire width of this table or column set into 3 fragments. That's why you're seeing here. And I can change this to 200 pixel. So this is what it looks like. So you have 3 columns again. Each has a fixed width, so it's not responsive. So you can see the width does not change. So that's what this example would look like. No, I don't want to change. I want to go back. Okay, and if you want a flexible grid width, and this is when you're using the FR, which we already saw. And so in this case, it does not specify any particular size in pixels for each column, instead of just saying how many fractions it will represent. So in this case, you can have a grid template, and you have one FR.
Flexbox?
Yeah, kind of, yeah. And you can change the ratios between these 3 FRs. I think that's probably the next example.
But it doesn't work like Bootstrap. There's 12 grids layout. These are.
You can define how many columns you want in total.
4 and 4.
Yeah.
Frames. That will be the same result.
We're going to actually cover that very soon about the difference from Bootstrap. Okay, so we already seen this one. Let's go here. If I reload the page. So this is the default one. When you're using 3 1FRs, that means I'm dividing the entire width into 3 parts, and each of them have the same width. And it can say have one more. Let's say 1FR more. So now I divide it into 4 columns, and each have the same width. And you can do more if you want. And also you can actually change the ratios between these columns. For example, instead of them have exactly the same width, I can use 2FR, 1FR, and 1FR. That means the first columns will be twice the size of the third and fourth one. So, okay, so that's what it would look like. So I had a 2FR, 1FR, and 1FR. So the fourth column is much bigger. And you can change this to, say, 2... 2, 2, and 1. So the first 2 columns will be the same size, which is twice, and as the third one. And you can easily use this to, say, lay out your page. For example, you want to have and maybe say the main content of your page and account to maybe 3/4 of the entire page, and the sidebar accounts for maybe the remaining 25%. And in that case, you just need to set 2 columns, and one is 3R, and the other one is 1FR. So this will be your main content, and this side will be the width for your sidebars, and you can adjust this as you want. Let me get back to the slide. The slides is here. Okay, and the next one you can actually change setting some space between the columns. So in this previous examples, there's no space between the columns. You can see they right next to each other, and you can add some space by using this grid gap command. And so see some quick example. So this will be the one with some gaps add in between. And so you can see, let me see where is, okay, so you have this one. Grid gap is 20 pixels, which is not just between the columns, also between the rows as well. And I can make it bigger, say 50 pixels, more space, or smaller, 5 pixels. So you can adjust this easily. And also, the other thing is this one is now responsive. So basically that means if you change width of the display, these boxes will resize automatically. Only the percentage remains the same. And but the gap itself remains fixed because you set it as pixel-wise. So the gap itself does not change with the width of the page. Ooh. Wow, I'm a little bit behind on this. Okay, and this is and there's something called repeat, and something allows you to write this definition a little bit faster. And when you want to have 3 columns, it's okay to say repeat one FR 3 times. But if you have 12 or 16 columns, then you have to write it 12 or 16 times. And instead, you can say repeat 12 or 16 here, and then 1 FR. That's all it does. So instead of repeating 1 FR 3 times, in this case, or 12 or 100 times, you can use this to make it faster. Okay. So far, we only specify, say in these examples, we only specify how many columns you want, and we didn't specify how many rows. And instead, the browser would figure out, okay, if I have 7 elements and each row fits 4 elements, then I will need 2 rows to fit this. Okay, this is called implicitly grid. And you could actually specify rows as well and use something similar command. So this is the command previously we used to set the columns, and you can have the equivalent of that to set rows. Okay, and in this example, we're starting to setting the rows as well. And here, the grid is same as before. For each, and for the entire width of the page, we have 3 columns. They are all of the same size, but you can see from 1 FR here. But instead, we add this more here, so we want to set the height of the rows, so to 100 pixel. I shouldn't really have to do this, but that's what it looks like. Otherwise, it will be the default value. Okay. This one is slightly more complicated. It says, we're going to come back to this in a second. There's no point. So basically, this one set the height of each row. You can say 100 pixels. I want to set 50, or even bigger, say 200. So this is a way how do you size the height of each row. No, I want to go back. Okay, and so this is, I see. And this is actually where it becomes more interesting. So there's a new function called the minmax that allows you to set minimum and maximum values you can use to set. Okay, and this allows you to set either, so basically the minimum and maximum values. So for example, when you design a web page, because can't really control the width of the display, and the height of a component like a div is usually decided by how much space is needed to fit all the, say, the text and picture in. So on a narrow display, it will require longer or higher box compared to a wide display where you need less height. But in some cases, you want to set a minimum height of each boxes, and then allows it to grow if there's more content needed. And so this is actually what we saw here in the first place. Oh, I closed that one. Okay, so this is the function. So here, instead of setting a grid rows as maximum or fixed value as 100 pixels, it says the minimum has to be 100 pixels and the maximum will be auto. That means the grid can grow in height as long as it needed to fit everything in. So if you look at that example again, yeah, and say in this one, you will not really see any difference when you change the size, and it only, let's say, if we have lots of text in one of the this is not what I wanted. Oh, it didn't really automatically. Because it's. So I try to create something, give it a little bit more content, so it will need higher than more space to display it. But because this is one word, so it's actually just creating.
Click enter to say.
Okay, and you can see, okay, because it's now has more content, it will start to grow, and this will grow as you want it, and the rest will remain the minimum size, which is 100 pixels, and for this part, it will allow you to grow, depends on how much space you have to fit in everything you needed. And you can actually also say set a maximum fixed height for these boxes as well. For example, I can set this maximum to 200 pixels, let's say, and this is not very nice. So this is what happens. And when you set a fixed height, then it no longer grows after 200 pixels. And you can set the overflow of the box. So for example, if you set overflow, you have a scroll bar on the side. I thought it might do it automatically, but it didn't. And if you set overflow, you have a scroll bar instead of just displayed outside the box. Okay. So that's the minmax function. Okay, so this is a slightly different way of setting the number of columns. So you don't have a fixed number of columns you want to set, and instead you just say want to fill in as many as you can. And so this is what you do. And so first, we say repeat, which is the same as before, and you will repeat what is inside here. So it says autofill, that means I try to put in as many as we can, and then the size or the width of each column is minimum 200, and it can be more, and each of them is one FR. That means each of these will have exact the same portion percentage. And similarly, we set the height of the rows as 100 pixel and auto before, so that's what we've seen before, doesn't change. And this is how it looks like. Okay, so you can see now when I have more space, and it will be able to fit in more columns, and we have less space to fit in less columns. Okay, so this is actually quite nice. For example, I can't remember now exactly which website, but some of the websites using this to lay out the display results. For example, even any e-commerce website, when you do a search, you had a return of the results, and this will allow you to decide how many to put in each row dynamically. It depends on the width of the display. Okay, so this is quite useful. Okay, and so far we only define the grid, and the next part is to actually put a component onto this grid. So for example, you will design your, say, the main, which is an article, or maybe a side element. You want to position them, use the grid, and you need to specify these 4 things. So the first 2 things is to specify the start and end point of the component in terms of columns. So I want to start from first column and at the third column. And this will also define the width of the column. And similarly, just for the grid, you can I want to start from the 5th row and end on the 6th row. And then it defines both the positions and the height. Oops. Yeah. So this is let's look at this example. Why ask me to translate? If we look at the formatting of this page, oops, not this one. It's a bit harder. It can go up further. Okay, and if you, for example, look at this element, and you can see on the formatting panel, and the way it is. Okay, these are all things. See? Where? Sorry, the wrong one. Padding, background, border, display, block. Why? See? Okay, sorry, so for this one, and you can see that's a div, which is container, which defines this template. It's the first, say, display grid. That means I want to use CSS Grid, and then defines the columns. So you have 2 columns. The first column is 1 FR, the second column is 3 FR, which is why you have these. And then you define the gap between the columns is 20 pixels. We have a little bit of space between the columns. And then for each of these, later on, it automatically just fill in the blocks. So this is the first block, so it will be this one, the first column in the first row, and the next one is article, so it goes to the first column, the second row, etc., etc. And then this aside goes to the second row, first column, because you only have 2 columns, each row is already filled here, and finally the footer is here. So this is not exactly what you would like to be yet. So basically, this is one when you're not specifying any starting or ending column or starting or ending row. So this is by default. If you define a grid, it will try to lay out and just fill in the grid as it goes. And now you can actually start to define the positioning. For example, now define header and the grid the column will start from 1, end with 3, and I want the row be in the first row. So if you remember, for each row we have 2 columns, and this is 1 is the starting of the first column, and the 3 is the end of the second column. So basically that means I want to cross entire page and or take vertically 1 row. And then if you see this one, I want my article, which is my main content part, and occupies the second column, which is the right-hand column, and occupies only the second row. So that's what this one. And the aside will be occupying the first column and the second row. So these two will be on the same row, but this one will on the left and this one on the right. And finally we have the footer, which takes the entire page width again, or entire row, but only taken the third row. And this is what it would look like. Okay, and so you can see for the header, it now takes from 1 to 3 of the first row, and I can make it smaller. For example, I can change that to 1 to 2, which only takes the half or the first column of the first row, or I can change 2 to 3, for example, and they will be on this part. And similarly, you can see that's your article. Now it's on the second row and second column, and aside will be on the second row but first column, and finally the footer, which across at the bottom, taking the entire third row. Okay, so that gives you completely flexibility of how do you want to position these things, and again these will become responsive as you change the size, and the relative position will not change, and this width of these or height will change just to make sure it fits everything in. Okay, let me change this back to what it was. Okay, and so this is a slightly different way to again specify the layout of your components. Oops, too quick. And so, it uses something called areas to specify how it would look like. So that's mainly this part. So what it says, I want to define a grid, and I call the first 2 columns, or the 2 columns of first row header, and this is the second row first column sidebar, and second row second column container, and this is called footer. And you still have this column template, which defines how many columns you have in each row and their relative size. And then when you define your, when you lay out your component, so you can just say header, it will be grid area. So that means I'm going to using this areas template, and this will occupy header. So it says header will be the top row, so that takes that part. And similarly for article, you would say I'm going to take the content in my grid. So that's the second row, second column. Sidebar would be here, so that's here, and the second row, first column, and finally the footer takes into bottom row. So this is how it would look like. Actually, exactly the same as the previous one, but we're using a slightly different way to define. And so, yeah, so this is where you define and the template areas, and this will be applied. And okay, for example, if I change this, okay, I made a small change to my layout. I say first row we have header, and second one will be content, and then sidebar and content. So I didn't change the rest of the layout here, but now the header, it will still be header, but only takes the first column in the first row. Yeah. So that's a different way using areas. Okay, and just because we are a little bit behind, I'm gonna skip through this part. Okay, I think this is the last slide, and which shows actually in the browser if you're using a grid, and it actually will be able to show this in the develop tools because it can understand the grid. It will be able to show the grid, how it's defined, and how each of these components align to the grid. Which, if I could, this is still code pen, so it might not be able to see the. Let me see if I can get the div inspect and find this. No. No, it does not quite show here, and even. Okay, so let's just show directly in the browser. Try to reduce the bottom panel a little bit. Come on. No. Okay, and in this case, and the browser can recognize, and here I'm using a grid. So if I mouse over that element, and in my develop tools, you can see the display on top. I can't move mouse because otherwise it will disappear. And this part you can display, okay, there's how many columns you defined and how each row is occupied by different components. You can easily see there's 3 rows and in total 12 columns you defined. Yeah, so that's quite easy. When you want to debug these things in the browser, you should use this tool. Okay, I think that's it.